Good evening, everybody. At the risk of repeating myself, my name is Steve Tinney, and I'm Deputy Director of the Penn Museum. Many thanks to all of you for coming to our beautifully refurbished Harrison Auditorium for tonight's installment of our annual Greats Lectures. This year, of course, our theme is Great Catastrophes, and they just seem to keep on coming, in real life as well as in our talks. The next lecture in our series will be on March 4th and will feature Dr. Robert D. Hicks of the Mutter Museum on the topic Spit Spreads Death, the influenza pandemic of 1918-19 in Philadelphia. Highly topical, right? As usual, after the lecture there'll be time for questions, which will be moderated by our speaker. And there are microphones just off the aisles there in the niches. You can come up and use them so that everybody can hear the questions as well as the answers. And so to our speaker, Dr. Clark Erickson is the curator in charge of the Penn Museum's American section and professor of anthropology here at the University of Pennsylvania. He came to us in 1988, just a couple years before me, from the anthropology department at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and has a lifetime interest in the peoples of South America and their relationship to their landscapes, working primarily in the Amazon and Andes. Clark is interested in the ways indigenous peoples understand their environment and create and manage landscapes, and of the implications of this for sustainable lifeways and environmental management. He has contributed multiple chapters to several volumes in connection with this, for example, in his edited volumes, Landscapes of Movement, The Anthropology of Trails, Paths and Road, and Time and Complexity in Historical Ecology, Studies in the Neotropical Lowlands. He is very much about understanding the people in the past and putting them right back in the frame of the material culture that so easily hogs the foreground. This is something that comes out in his digital humanities research and teaching, where he works hard to people the past virtually, and as a perspective which was deeply influential in the reconceptualization of the remains from Sitio Conte, which gave birth to Beneath the Surface, a wonderful exhibition from a few years back, which some of you, I'm sure, recall. So without further ado, please join me now in welcoming Clark to talk about Overturning of Space and Time, the End of the Inca Empire.
In my many trips to the Andes, I've experienced mild earthquakes, seen roads destroyed by rainy season landslides, experienced severe droughts and flooding caused by El Nino events and climate change, and even false tsunami warnings while eating at a restaurant at sea level. Many catastrophes also have a cultural element. How do people prepare, if at all? How do they respond? And how do they survive and thrive afterwards? Past and present people throughout the world and in the Andes were constantly threatened, but persisted and survived. Many of my Peruvian colleagues and their ancestors faced frequent catastrophic events, some apparently lasting decades or longer, documented in the archaeological record. A major earthquake can occur around cycles of about 300 years, and they shake up the earth, of course. But a lot of times, just shake it up. It all sort of stays there. But then an El Nino event comes, bringing rain where it never rains on the coast of Peru and droughts in the highlands. But that rain comes down in torrential sheets down the mountainsides, and it mixes with all that loose soil from the last earthquake, sweeping it down and often destroying entire valleys, sometimes multiple valley systems. For instance, in the Peru earthquake of 1970, before I started working in Peru, in Bolivia, destroyed many of the towns along the coast of Peru, especially in the northern highlands, caused massive sheets of glacial ice to slide into glacial lakes that then came roaring down the mountainside, stirring up soil, rocks. Look at these boulders here. This is the remains of the community where some 70,000 people lost their lives. You can see the little palms there, which marked the old plaza, and nothing left. So for this talk, I was thinking about Andean concepts of catastrophe and sort of our version in English. And so I want to look this up. So I looked it up in the dictionary, and I loved finding the etymology of this: overturning, sudden turn, overthrow, ruin, calamitous fate, an event producing a subversion of order and the system of things. Now, Andean peoples have an interesting concept where they call Pachacuti. And it's recorded in many of the early documents we have from indigenous writers and Spanish writers, and continues up to the present in a lot of native people's minds. And this is an idea. Pachacuti means a change or turn, that's kuti, and time space, pacha, commonly accepted as a revolution or turning upside down of time and space in the Andean world. Rather than being purely apocalyptic, though, it implies a completion of a cycle, rebirth, fresh start, starting anew. So it's got another side to it besides the catastrophe side built into it. So Andean peoples recognize multiple Pachacuti events in the past, and they explain their history, their evolution through these concepts. And so the Creator God created a world, much like the Great Flood and Noah's Ark, decided that people were no good, erased them, created a new group of people, another Pachacuti, erased them, and you can imagine going through 5 of these epics. Who is the last of those peoples? The Incas, of course, right? And the Incas bring the sun, they bring civilization, they bring order and law to the Andes. And of course, they're manipulating this as a propaganda strategy, but most Andean peoples see the world and history through this way. Now, the Incas, and I've talked about them in other lectures here in the same room in the past, and just a brief introduction. So the Incas were only the last 100 years or so of Andean prehistory, which goes back probably some of the first evidence of some what we possibly recognize as civilization goes back 5,000 years ago, and people have occupied this area since the end of the Ice Age. And so most people are familiar with Machu Picchu, the wonderful work, but actually in reality, this is a tiny little site compared to most sites, but it certainly is the best known. Incas are famous for their technology, engineering in all different realms. The most remarkable is their stone cutting, quarrying this material and building palaces, temples, cities with stone and other materials. But probably their real accomplishment was what they did to the landscape. And I believe that there's probably not anywhere in the Andes that doesn't have human alterations, transformations. In many cases, this is to improve things, especially for production. So when the Incas conquered someone or brought them in through alliance, they said, okay, we own everything now, but we're graciously going to give you back the land you farm, and we're going to use your labor and other people's labor to open up new lands for the state of the Inca, for the temple of the sun, and for other kinds of activities. So in a sense, the Incas, graciously giving back what the community already had, but they're imposing their own engineering skills and turning marginal lands, such as steep hillsides such as this, into productive for corn and other major crops. Did the same along the coast and through the highlands, extending growing seasons by bringing water down from the glacial peaks to waterlands that normally would not have enough. And one of the ways they did this was through what we call the labor tax. So instead of paying out of what you harvested each year to the king, as many areas in the world, you paid with your labor. We don't know exactly how long this was. It could have been a month, it could have been maybe 2 months per able-bodied adult, and everybody would serve the Inca state as best they could. So they would go to different work sites, create terraces, build stone temples, on and on and on. And This system also was, you could think of it as a social event also, because the workers expected to be fed, housed, to have music, essentially have a good time, a very festive occasion while they're doing the work. It was kind of expected. And so the Incas, put on theater, performance, as all part of this, what would be essentially drudgery or work, right? The Incas also created a massive road system that's been recently recognized as World Heritage. This is a very wide stretch of the Inca Road along the coast of Peru near Trujillo in the north coast. This network connects southern Colombia down to central Chile, and then various trunk roads going from the coast to the highlands connected the empire in this incredibly tight web. The Incas are also famous for using that labor to create wonderful works. And the museum, unfortunately, we don't have an Inca exhibit on display now, but we'll have one hopefully in the near future to be able to see Penn's wonderful collection of the artwork and materials that Andean people have produced. Now, we know we have lists of the kings in the Inca Empire. You think, well, how long were they around? They were only around about 100 years as an empire, maybe less. And so we don't know a whole lot about the early kings. Some people argue they're mythical, they're kind of made up, they may or may not be real. But we know a lot about these last ones here. And these are known from oral histories, and the Spanish actually encountered many of these face to face. One of the last Inca kings was Huayna Capac, and he was expanding the empire, particularly in the north, but also in parts of the south. And so we know that the Inca kings actually were on the battlefront. Now, they're probably certainly protected, but he's always depicted in these very early scenes by Huaman Poma, who in 1605 wrote a beautiful 1,200-page document called the Letter to the King, complaining about the abuse of Spaniards, the Inca peoples, and also to talk about Inca history and the glories of Inca history. So many of the images I have are from his important document. Here we see Huayna Capac in his war gear, one of his many sort of characteristics or traits. Inca army could mobilize 10,000 people or more, depending on the need. They could use the roads. They had supplies along the roads, so they could stop, be fed, housed, and then move on to wherever they were needed. They were a formidable force, and we now know we can identify their garments. So these are fairly common in museum collections and also in Peru. So you can imagine lines and lines and lines of warriors on the open field wearing this checkerboard pattern, very, very distinct, and you could see it from a long distance. Probably sent terror into their enemies. Also used very simple weapons. It was all about hand-to-hand combat. So various kinds of maces and clubs and things like this, most of it made of stone or wood. The peoples that they brought in to fight for them, many of these were conquered peoples that joined the army and participated, sort of brought their own skills and outfits along with it. So it was probably kind of a ragtag army in some ways. We also know that almost any Andean person at that time probably knew how to use a sling. So this is like a David and Goliath sling, and a very deadly weapon, today used for herders to keep animals away, prey from the herds, things like this. So the Spanish didn't arrive in Peru until 1532. But in 1524, 8 years before the Spanish arrived, the Andes was devastated by diseases. We don't know exactly what the disease was. There's sort of these descriptions from oral histories, but they think it was measles or probably combined with smallpox and possibly an indigenous disease called verruga peruana. Measles, smallpox are not native to the New World, so they came over from Europe. How did they get to the Andes before the first Spaniard? Well, the Spanish were in fighting the Aztecs and Mayas and the chiefdoms in Panama and those areas. Those diseases spread from village to village to village rapidly down through the Andes, killed thousands and thousands of people, and killed Huayna Capac, the Inca king. This is a very kind of romantic scene, nothing like accurate, but it's showing the burial of him. So he was in the field fighting enemies, and caught this disease and died. His youngest son also died. So then the empire was put into panic. Who's going to be the successor? So Atahualpa, who was a fighter, and he led his own army in the far north in Ecuador at the time, he says, I don't want to be king. I'm going to start my own Inca Empire in the north, kind of set up his own world there. So it passes to Huáscar, who was only 19 years old at the time, and he has loyalty to Cusco and sort of the old guard. Now, these two half-brothers hated each other, and so they were fighting each other in a literal civil war years before the Spanish arrived. After 4 years of this civil war, finally Atahualpa's troops were able to capture Atahualpa, dragged him off his fancy litter, and executed him and much of his family and lineage to kind of erase that history of that part of the Inca dynasty. Now, at the same time, Francisco Pizarro is fighting with Cortez in Mexico in 1519. And he sees all the wealth that Cortez and his key conquistadors got. So he wants some of the action too. So the thing that most Spaniards looking for that would just let's go somewhere else. So let's find these golden, they call them El Dorados or golden cities. And the Spanish were crazy for gold. So they were sending expensive expeditions out to here, to there, and every single one of them failed to a certain degree. Most of the people who participated on it died, and they came back in shame. Some of them did find gold, but not many of them. So the stories were about the golden one, and I talked about this in another lecture here a couple years ago. This kind of myth develops of an indigenous leader who covers himself every day with gold powder, and I just washes it off at night. And these images that the Spanish are thinking about, but we do have golden men, like the Lord of Sipan, a pre-Inca culture on the coast of Peru, but you can see kind of outfits, and the Spanish are just, they want this. So there were a number of expeditions south by Pizarro, and they were sort of hugging the coast, kind of tentatively checking things out. They weren't finding what they wanted, like a culture like the Aztecs in present-day Panama and Colombia. And but a fortuitous accident, I guess, or thing happened. They ran into a Peruvian fishing raft, or not, I'm sorry, cargo raft. This is, so we don't, that boat has disappeared, but we do have some historic images from the turn of the century of similar rafts and some artwork you see here. So these had massive cotton sails, and apparently were carrying tons and tons of produce, including gold, silver, and other things important for the trade along the coast. They may have been going as far north as Baja California, we're not even sure. But, so the crew was thrown overboard, drowned by the Spaniards, got what they thought was valuable, but they took two young men who spoke Quechua. Now, this probably maybe wasn't an Inca boat, but the Quechua language would now become very important because they could talk with their enemies eventually. Pizarro needs financing. He's a pig farmer from the uplands of Spain. So he goes to the present king, King Charles of Spain, says, I need money for this expedition. I need 3 ships. I need horses. I need armor. He says, okay, give us the whatever 10% of anything you find, but do not kill any kings. This Cortez killed Montezuma, and as my king, I don't want to die, right? But essentially free reign. So Pizarro makes landfall in what's present-day northern Peru in Tumbes area. He's actually well greeted by the locals. They come out, they bring fresh food because they've been on the ocean for a while, fresh water, invite them inland. They do all kinds of trading, and the Spanish by this time knew they had to bring, little trinkets and things that native peoples would like, especially glass beads and metal objects, especially knives and axes. In this time, they would be made of iron. And made landfall, unloaded their horses. At the same time, I'm sure that the Inca king, Atahualpa, knows what's going on because he's got spies all over the place. And they've come running up the Inca roads to him to say, there's some weird people just landed. We don't know. They got these weird animals with them, these big horses, and I didn't know what those were. So Atahualpa had been fighting year after year after year against his half-brother, but also against the enemies of the Inca state. And his army was exhausted. And so they had made camp in present-day Cajamarca in the northern highlands of Peru. So on the first day of the encounter, Pizarro and his men made a fast march up to Cajamarca. They knew the Inca was going to be there. So they had a sort of a meeting, confrontation, whatever. And De Soto, the famous Hernan de Soto, who explored a lot of the southwest United States later, he's a great horseman. He came barging up on this giant horse and pulled up right before the Inca king, seated on the ground. He didn't flinch. But a couple of his soldiers, his bodyguards, flinched. They were executed immediately. So he wasn't very impressed with the Spanish at that time. So now Pizarro is getting nervous about what's going to happen. He's only got this tiny group of 170 conquistadors, most of them fairly well armed, a couple horses, some of these little like musket cannons that made a lot of noise, didn't do a lot of damage. And so he says, we got to come up with a plan. He thinks, what did Cortez do? Cortez immediately, he was outnumbered too. He got Moctezuma, the Aztec king, held him hostage. That's the way you conquer an empire like this. So they made a plan. The Inca king, the next day, came out to meet them, came on his litter and the descriptions. And Pizarro and the priests that they had brought with them had a holy Bible. And he said, this is the word of God. They could talk to the Incas because they had these translators. So these, translate Spanish to Quechua. And he said, the Inca put it up to his ear. He says, I can't hear anything. It's not speaking to me. He threw it on the ground, and that was the sign, go get him. And the Spanish cavalry came roaring out from their hiding place, took the king, dragged him off the litter, took the king almost immediately. So we don't know what the battle was like. There's these fanciful things that they didn't have cannons like that, but it sort of gives you something of the chaos at that particular time. Now we know that probably in minutes, but probably over a period of about several hours, the Spanish, with their very sharp, heavy swords and lances, just went through the crowds of these soldiers and just swatting right and left, killing, at least some estimates, 7,000 of them. And none of them were resisting. Now, why is that? So we think maybe they were just so demoralized, the fact that these outsiders, intruders, could take our king. It was just impossible. So they probably just completely lost heart at this because they've been fighting with him for years and years. So why were the Spanish 168 conquistadors against maybe 80,000 Incas? Why were they successful? Why didn't the Inca army resist? Well, there's a number of things. They were weakened, right, with these diseases that were spreading, and also they'd been fighting for a long time. Now the Spanish, the common received wisdom about the Spanish, they had better weapons. They had steel, they had protection, and there's quite a contrast between sort of Inca weaponry and protection and Spanish. So you see here some various outfits of the time, the use of the horses. Sometimes the horses themselves were armored, but there's a lot of variety because the poor conquistadors were less equipped than the ones that came from, say, richer families or had better sponsorship. Atahualpa was taken and they sort of created a jail for him in the Spanish compound. And they said, the Incas should not resist us because we've got your king. We'll let him go if you will give us all your gold and silver. And so we know that for a year, Atahualpa lived in this sort of room. He was allowed visitors. They would come, lots of people crying and weeping and things like this. And Pizarro himself actually taught him how to play chess. So they, communicated, passed the time and stuff. But being treacherous, something else is going to happen. So the ransom agreement to set him free was this existing room there near where he was held. The Spanish took their sword, held it up against the wall, tapped the wall, and said, this has to be filled 2 times with gold and silver. And so the Spanish sometimes went out with the native Inca groups out to the various temples, to the various cities throughout the empire, and hauling this stuff. This is a fanciful image, but they describe just tons and tons of gold being ripped off of temples, things being pulled out of houses, maybe even from some burials, and certainly from some of the mummy crypts, and were all carted up to Cajamarca to be, unfortunately, all this beautiful stuff melted down into ingots, okay? Probably 24 tons, that's metric tons of gold and silver. Not all of it was pure. Most of it probably never even got back to Spain. It's on the ocean bottom somewhere, shipwrecked, things like that, or financed wars in Spain, and they're all gone. So Pizarro said, if we let this guy live, it's just going to cause problems if we let him free. So, of course, he executed him. Pretty gruesome way, garroting it's called. Spanish marched to Cusco because they figure out that's the capital and that's going to probably have lots and lots of more gold and resources. In Cusco, they arrive. This is a regal royal center. It kind of looks like a city, but it's more of a very special purpose. Lots of palaces of the living and dead kings and all the servants that work for them, and then a retaining area around it of where people provide food, and then labor coming in to build the wonderful buildings there from all over the empire. The Spanish are still very few. More boats are coming from Spain, bringing in people, reinforcements, but they're still very outnumbered. So they figure we're going to install a puppet king, somebody we can control. So they take young Manco Inca, the son of Huayna Capac, who's in Cusco, and have him inaugurated through Inca-style inauguration, but also recognized by the Spaniards to lead the Incas, essentially do their bidding for them. He does that for a couple of years, and he realizes the Spanish are just abusive, they can't keep their word, and this is not looking good for us. So he gets all his retinue, his army, everybody, and they all take a forced march out of Cusco, down the Sacred Valley, past Machu Picchu, into the wild tropical forests of Upper Amazon, in an area called Vilcabamba. The Spanish, from Wampoma's document, the Spanish retaliated, burning Inca shrines, temples, and their sacred mummies. There's long-term practice of mummifying bodies, especially of important people, and they're venerated. Some of the bodies are brought out for kind of theater events and things like this. They participate in normal life. The Spanish just burn these things up. The Incas, in response, burned Spanish churches that were already being established in some Spanish settlements. And the Incas were doing quite well against the Spaniards. The Spanish were terrified that they were finally going to be driven out into the sea and lose this foothold on this new colony for Spain and incredible wealth. So they fought as best they could back, but they were becoming very disheartened and had suffered a lot of defeats. Many of them were captured and executed in public events in various Inca towns. Using this guerrilla base, this what we call the Neo-Inca state, they could send very mobile groups of people up to the old Inca roads and lay in wait for the Spaniards that are moving from city to city, cut off their reinforcements, get their supplies. And they had surrounded Cusco, Peru, and it looked like they were going to finally eliminate the Spaniards, at least there. And a Spanish army who had gone down to Chile returned to Cusco at the right moment. They were able to break the Inca siege, and the Incas then retreated, and Cusco was saved for the Spaniards. So this issue about superior weapons, so there's a lot written about that if you're interested in warfare and war history and things like that. So the story is, that they had such great weaponry that a single cavalryman could, wipe out hundreds of Incas. So we have some cases of mass execution or mass burials near Lima, Peru, very well-preserved bodies. My graduate student at the time, Melissa Murphy, worked with a Peruvian archaeologist to analyze those, and they found very interesting things. One of the crania of a young male had a round hole in it, and so there are various kinds of indigenous weapons that could cause that. But they looked at it very carefully under microscopes, high-powered, and they saw that it actually had little flakes of lead in it, which means it's probably a musket ball. It went through the skull and out the other side from these one sort of single-shot little muskets that the Spanish had. And there were cuts on the upper body and the head from probably heavy Spanish swords. But it was only a few of the some 70 individuals in this mass grave. The rest of them had these bash marks on their heads and stuff that was from a totally different weapon. These would have been indigenous clubs and indigenous hand-to-hand weapons. So who's killing who here? The Spaniards like to say, we won this battle, various battles, especially to save Lima, Peru on the coast against the Incas, but it was actually native allies, people who were trying to side with the Spaniards, thinking they get a good deal, or they didn't like the Incas, so they wanted to get rid of them. So we know so much of the success of the Spanish was because of these alliances and turning native Andean peoples against the Incas. And we know that the Spanish could mobilize huge armies when necessary. But one of the problems of Andean armies is that you've got to go home for a while to plant, to cultivate, to do your kind of normal life stuff. So it tends to be a seasonal activity, serving in the army. So sometimes, it's certain times of year where you can mobilize people. And also, if they're not finished with a siege or something, they just go home. So where is this place, Vilcabamba? So Vilcabamba refers to a region in the upper Amazon region of Peru, but it also refers to an actual capital of the Incas, two major sites in the area I'll talk about, Victos and Vilcabamba. So Cusco is shown there in the red dot. Many of you are familiar with Machu Picchu, so that would be about a week's fast walk from Cusco. Take the train today, you go there much faster. So that's the edge of the tropical forest. And then Victos, which is deep, deep into the tropical forest, at lower altitude, so it's tropical forest environment. And then their big refuge city where they could easily defend was Vilcabamba, or sometimes called Espiritu Pampa, far into the tropical forest. Get an idea of what this terrain looks like. So Cusco's behind those white mountain glacier peaks at the top of the image. And you wind down through that incredibly rough terrain. You can see the bright green on Google Earth. That's tropical forest. It would have been probably continuous tropical forest in many of these areas at the time. A good hiding place for the Neo-Inca state. So we know quite a bit about this now. Few archaeologists wanted to go down in this area, and most of them tend to be very short trips, kind of explorer-type explorations, get some credit for discovering something new, and then leave. Hiram Bingham is credited with the discovery of Machu Picchu, as many of you know, but he didn't discover it. It was known by local peoples. It was known by local scholars. It appears on maps. And so, but he was the one, of course, that made it famous using National Geographic to deliver his message, his wonderful photographs, maps, his publications, and get it out to the world. And he got a lot of credit for that and was able to finance more expeditions. So in 1911, he went to Machu Picchu, and he climbed up there, looked around, stayed for maybe an hour. Took him 2 hours to 3 hours to get up there. went back. Didn't impress him that first trip. It was only later when he started thinking about it, his next trip, that it became the place. So he continued down. He's looking for this lost city of Vilcabamba. We know about it from Spanish eyewitness accounts that are written down. We know about it from Inca accounts. They were told to Spaniards and recorded of their histories. And we know the names. When the Spanish did trips down there to try to capture the Inca or destroy them, they talk about places, and many of these can be found on toponyms or on modern-day maps. So in Victos and Vilcabamba, covered completely with tropical forest, very difficult to see anything, he found these incredible Inca centers. You can see some of his early photographs here from one of his first publications on Vilcabamba. Inca storage vessels, probably for making corn beer here. And he also excavated for a short time at what's called the White Rock, or Urak Rumi, and which was a major, possibly sun temple for the Incas. So they had not only moved their government down to this area, but also their temples and probably their sacred wakas or sacred objects, and probably maybe some of the Inca mummies from past leaders. Some colleagues of mine recently have been excavating here and found some incredible things I'll talk briefly about. This rock had a number of buildings around it. Most of these were probably ritual and ceremonial use. So we have Bingham coming down there, and then Jean Savoy, who was a very famous explorer, not very good archaeologist, but he discovered he was very interested in the tropical forest regions of the Andes and discovered many of or at least recorded, put on maps, made them famous, many of the now important sites where along the frontier with Amazonian cultures and Andean cultures. Vincent Lee is an architect, incredible architect. He spent decades down in the area going from site to site, not only the big sites, but also the small ones. And because of his architectural skills, he could do incredible maps, and most of the maps you'll see here. This is the front of probably Manco Inca's palace constructed. We know it's an important building because of the double inset doorways, the trapezoidal doorways that you see here. They had to, since it's a rough terrain, they had to kind of carve into the landscape. When we look at Inca sites, you tend to look at the buildings that stand above the ground. Oh, wow, look at that, that's really cool. Well preserved. But it's really under the ground is where all the technology and engineering is. This is a heavy rainfall area, so underneath all these structures are drain structures, all kinds of artificial earth and gravel and stuff that were placed into these huge monumental platforms to support the weight of the structures above them. A number of very large buildings, public spaces, because the Inca were all about performance and theater, so they always had to have large plazas for all kinds of events associated with the state. They also had agricultural terraces, just like they did in the highlands, so they carved out the mountainsides, brought in water, and brought in their crops, turning areas that were probably unfarmed before into heavily farmed areas. Building huge complexes, very classic Inca style. Some of the drawings by Lee. And the excavations from Hiram Bingham and also from more recent times, many of the more recent ones have been very systematic and careful. This came out in an article just last month in our major magazine from a Peruvian report. Talking about this incredible pottery vessel, very classic Inca styles, about this big around, with this wonderful polychrome paint around it, very kind of non-Inca style. The Incas weren't into doing a lot of images of humans, of animals, things like this. It's more sort of geometric patterns were the most common. And so here you see two Spaniards on horses, these Inca depictions of horses. And the scene wraps around the pottery vessel in fragments, but has been reconstructed. And what we're actually looking at is a battle recorded in this simple artwork. The Spanish on their horses and with their armor and their special weapons versus the Incas, shown on the ground usually with all their different weapons and fancy costumes of the warriors, and also rows and rows of prisoners with ropes around their necks, probably commemorating the Incas' resistance to multiple times the Spanish came down with larger armies to try to wipe them out, and they held off. This also probably relates to an Andean concept called Incari. And Andean peoples, especially in the rural areas, even today, have this idea that the Inca kings, and it's kind of generic Inca kings, they're not dead. The Inca lives up in the glacial peaks in the highest mountains. And they cut the head off of the Inca, the Spanish, but the head is regrowing a body, or sometimes it's vice versa. The body's growing a head. And the Inca's going to emerge and lead Andean peoples to victory and drive the Spanish off. So these kinds of ideas we know a lot about in anthropology because we see them in various areas, especially heavily colonialized areas with people undergoing violence. And one response is this sort of to develop what we call millenarian movements, rally around charismatic figures and essentially get rid of the oppressors. Here you see an Inca queen holding one of the last Inca's heads there, and that head will come back. The double-headed serpent, it also has a lot to do with rebirth, and Pachacuti also, the concept of refreshing the world. Manco Inca lived in his hideaway for 10 years, harassing the Spanish continually. The Spanish came down and captured his wife, the queen, so another queen executed by the Spaniards, another no-no, and infuriated the Incas, more attacks. But the Spanish were also fighting themselves. And so the Inca, for the Incas, this is great. The Spanish are going to fight each other. They're not going to fight us anymore. Some of the ones wanted to break away from Spain. So they were defeated by the the Spanish crown. And so they either were imprisoned, beheaded, the Spaniards, or they left. So where'd they go? So some of them went down, 2 of them went down to Vilcabamba, hung out there. They were welcomed by the Incas because they fought the Spaniards. But they got kind of tired of not being around their kind. And they also felt their treatment wasn't what they deserved. And so they murdered Manco Capac. You can imagine the scene this caused. It was in the plaza outside his palace. And they were immediately executed in public. And then a new leader had to be brought in. So Sairi Topa was Manco's very young son. He became the new king. He was a very cosmopolitan person, and we know that he really wanted not to live in the tropical forest down there in the heat and humidity. He wanted to go back to Cusco and made a deal with the Spanish that he could retain some of their ancestral royal estate outside of Cusco, one of the richest ones with 2,000 workers, and he could live in comfort there and live side by side with the Spanish. He also traveled with a retinue to Lima, Peru to meet the viceroy of the colony, the Spanish colony. Supposedly treated well. He came back to Cusco. The native peoples went crazy, greeting him. But he ended up going back to Vilcabamba. And unfortunately, he died probably of disease, old disease. We don't know exactly. But 2 priests that he had invited down to Christianize the Incas, not forcefully necessarily, but to build some churches and things, and also so the Inca could learn from the Spaniards. They were blamed because they had tried to help him, giving him some tea or something, and the Incas thought they'd poisoned him. So they were executed. One of them, I think I have an image of a few minutes later. Tito Cusi Yupanqui, then another young son of Manco Inca, starts to rule in 1560. And a wonderful document came out last year. It's his personal account of the Incas, his biography, and what's going on in the world in great detail. He probably was learning Spanish at the time, but not literate enough. So he used the priests to essentially said, if you're going to be here, write this stuff down. And then it's been published in various forms in Spanish, and most recently a wonderful account that I highly recommend in English. On some of the sites that have been found in this area, it's interesting that you see juxtaposition of outside things like Spanish churches that were constructed, Spanish tiles were introduced, and so the Incas figured out tiles were sometimes much better than the thatched roofs they had, more fireproof, so they adopted things like that. Weaponries, tools, any kind of useful things that they could use, glass. And if you look at the background there, there's some round houses there. Those are not Inca. And we know that the Incas were living in this area of the Amazon, in alliance with the Amuecia, or it used to be called the Campa, native groups, Amazonian peoples, very different from the Incas. But we know that they probably have a long, long history of interaction with Incas and Quechua speakers going back at least maybe 1,000 years. We can see some evidence of that, peaceful relationships with Amazonian peoples, which in other parts of the Amazon Andean frontier, it was hostile. They were bitter enemies. The priest that was blamed for the death of the king was executed publicly, and there was a lot of work done on his biography and the miracles that he had supposedly heard to essentially turn him into a martyr. His body was actually dug up by the Spanish later and brought to Cuzco and then put in one of the major cathedrals there. So the Incas are not doing very well. These kings, they're holding out for 30 plus years outside with sovereignty, autonomy from the Spaniards and harassing the Spaniards, getting them to the truce table, things like this. Spanish try over and over again to send armies in and get them, failed. So the last Inca king, only around for 1 year, was a very young, well, they're all young, Tupac Amaru. And he was crowned, and so the Spaniards just said, this is it. Toledo, who was the new sort of Spanish administrator for the entire colony, he had a very sort of harsh hand on everything, reorganizing native peoples, getting rid of their idols, destroying them, trying to make them into good Catholics. And he said, get a huge army together. We're going down there and finish this. So they go down, they get to Victos. The town is completely burned and destroyed. Everything of value has been either taken out or destroyed. The Incas move further down into the tropical forest to Vilcabamba. And then the Spanish, after a couple of weeks, drive down there, take that town, but the Incas are gone. So now they're out in the tropical forest, no Inca roads. We're going to find these guys. That's our goal here. So Tupac Amaru and his young wife, who was pregnant, it was a small group. They're going downstream, further into Amazonia. The Spanish find out that that's where they are, so they go down. They finally catch them. They can't move fast because she's like eight months pregnant or so. So they're captured and then brought to Cuzco, publicly paraded through the street. You can imagine this young guy, who's the Inca, in all his finery, and the proud Spaniards, with a chain around his neck. These are images from Huamampoma, from his document, showing this very important event in Andean history. And then, of course, the Spanish gruesomely execute him after a short trial, and I think the body was destroyed. And one thing the Incas were good about, a lot of them converted to Catholicism in the last days, probably not to be good Christians, but because they did not want their bodies burned, because that's the last thing an Andean person wants. And so you could at least be buried and treated with respect. Spanish didn't always go along with that. Okay, so I think, I'll talk a little bit about what happened after the Spanish gained control. So Spanish set up sort of the equivalent of haciendas, called an encomienda, to reward the conquistadors and the richer folk that were coming over from Spain. Reward them for their work. They were giving huge tracts of land and all the indigenous labor within those tracts of land. Essentially, serfs, slaves, you call them, horrible life for most of those communities, working for Spaniards, generally being abused. This is Huamampoma's many, many pages of drawings and discussion and text about the abuses of the Spaniards. Here he shows Benedictine priests abusing Andean women or weavers. In Toledo, the same guy who sent the army down to get rid of the Incas. He decided that he's going to reorganize the Andes, set up utopian communities in perfect Spanish towns, and move all the native peoples from their dispersed hamlets and villages and towns into these where they could be controlled. Their labor, they could convert them to Catholicism, but mainly for their labor. So these tended to have, a grid system with a town plaza. You had your mayor's office, your church, your jail, overlooking that. Typical you'd see throughout Latin America, Spanish towns. And then streets going off where the native peoples would live. The town where I worked doing my dissertation work in the 1980s was an old Reducción town and still occupied today. A lot of the grid system is still there, and it's actually on top of an older Inca site. We think that there's conservative estimates that 10 million people lived in the Andes when the Spanish arrived. Others say up to 100 million people. We don't really know. But probably within 100 years after the Spanish arrived, 90% of those people had died. So you can imagine the devastation. Most of this was through disease, some through warfare, these attacks and stuff, abuse of people's labor, malnutrition, and also most of the people probably who survived the diseases were sent to the mines. This is various mines in Potosi, the richest silver mine at its time in the world. And to do this kind of labor, my colleague Doug Schmidt, who's an archaeologist here at Penn, he's been studying mercury. So quicksilver has to be used to separate when you get ores that aren't nice, chunks of silver, you've got to get the ore separated from its matrix and use a highly toxic substance, mercury, to do that. And so you can imagine, smelling this stuff, and you have to heat it up and things, the numbers of people that died, and also mine accidents and things like this. I talked about some of these millenarian movements. They're two famous of many, many rebellions against the Spaniards. So these were charismatic figures. One was Tupac Amaru, named after the last Inca king, intentionally. The other was Tupac Katari, an Aymara speaker in Bolivia. And they had surrounded many of the Spanish cities, were fighting, but they could only hold their armies together for a couple of months, and then the siege would break, and the Spanish were set free. So they were failed, and they were, of course, executed. Some indigenous peoples look at some of the more modern events in Peru as examples of Pachacuti, or this overturning of time and space. And so you could look at some major times that Peru went through some very bad experiences for a decade or more, fighting the Shining Path, the military against the Shining Path, and most the native peoples were caught between these two forces. War raged on. Some 70,000 people were recorded to have died during that period, most of them indigenous peoples in the countrysides. And other movements parallel to them, not quite as significant, Tupac Amaru, which you might know about when they took the Japanese embassy for a whole year in Lima, Peru. Let's see. Drugs. So Andes produce cocaine, coca leaf, and converted into cocaine, and then sent throughout the world. So with our effort, various other nations to do the drug war, essentially, which was a war. Many areas throughout the Andes where you see a plane fly over and dumping tons and tons of toxins on the landscape to defoliate, the same stuff, Agent Orange, that was used in Vietnam. And many of these soils today are still contaminated that people have to deal with. And in this case, native peoples were caught between the forces of the drug dealers and also the military and DEA and other agencies fighting against cocaine and coca production. So some of this resistance of native peoples, and some people would consider another Pachacuti, was the election of Evo Morales in Bolivia, recently deposed and now in exile in Mexico, I think. But he was one of the first native peoples, he's a Quechua speaker from probably a descendant of the Incas in Bolivia. And he learned his trade as a coca grower and a union organizer, so learned politics that way. very popular figure for many years, major reforms in Bolivia to give Native peoples more power. So I think I'd like to talk more about the contributions of the Incas, but one thing I really want to emphasize is the Incas or Andean peoples are still around. The latest figure I saw was 8 to 10 million people, mostly in the Andes, some scattered throughout the world now, speak Quechua. Some 5 million or more speak Aymara and hundreds of other dialects and languages throughout the area. There's certain times in the past when it's okay to be a Native people and claim that ethnicity and that heritage, and other times it's not so good. And I think that for most Andean peoples, they've seen these pachacutis occur one after the other, but the world does renew itself. Thank you.